The year is 1967. Buildings burned and collapsed. Riots purged the streets. Fear crowds the atmosphere. Pressure closing in from everyone.
Police, every time you see one of them, he gonna stop a brother. He don't never stop nobody. That's why we out here riding.
The citizens, the rioters, and government officials. They know not what started this chaos, but they know the reason. Rights taken away from minorities. Discrimination rampant throughout the country. This is the rights and responsibilities of the Detroit riots of 1967.
Before the 1967 Detroit riots, African Americans faced harsh living and working conditions, marked by systematic racism and segregation. African Americans were confined to overcrowded towns like Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. Racial discrimination in hiring, promotions, and mistreatment by employers and coworkers were prominent issues in Detroit. Schools in African American neighborhoods were overcrowded, underfunded, and poorly resourced, limiting opportunities for economic stability. With limited job opportunities outside factory work, poverty rates in Black neighborhoods skyrocketed. Job losses made it difficult for families to afford rent, leading to increase in evictions, homelessness, and more job loss. Before the 1967 Detroit riots, authorities ignored clear warnings regarding systematic racial discrimination, police brutality, housing segregation, and economic inequality affecting African American residents.
The event that started the riot was the exponential increase in racial inequality among African Americans in Michigan. Some of these included police brutality and discrimination, economic inequality, housing discrimination, and overall rising tensions. This was important because the aftermath led to the creation of many equal rights organizations to come to life. Unfair treatment by the police worked to increase tensions rather than lower them. African American mistreatment by law enforcement deepened the divide between the police and the community. The failure to address Detroit's underlying issues led to an assumption of carelessness from the police. The community was in a state of distrust and fear.
In an interview with Dr. Norris, someone who experienced the riots firsthand, he was asked, how was the police interacting with the community during the time?
Policing in those days, they had a unit called the Big Four, Stress Fape Street. I forget what it was, but they had these units, special units, and they certainly were tough on, white thugs, I guess, white delinquents. But the policing in the Black neighborhoods was qualitatively different.
So they were more strict on the Black neighborhoods than the white neighborhoods?
Tougher, yes.
Governor Romney traced the causes of these riots to systemic racism, ineffective urban policies, and a lack of federal aid. He aimed to fix these issues and identified them as the main reasons for the uprising and tensions in Detroit at the time. Because African Americans in Detroit faced job discrimination, finding a good-paying, safe job was incredibly difficult. They often had to settle for a low-paying, white-dominated job. Additionally, certain neighborhoods were often dedicated to housing as many African Americans as possible, overcrowding the area. Similarly, education was very limited, as well as underfunded and ignored in the grand aspect of it all. Overall, these few factors combined with the fact that racial inequality was already high, frustration and anger brewed, creating aggression.
Later in our interview with Dr. Norris, we asked, were there any leaders or activists in the community who stood out as impactful?
Willie Horton stood out to me. He spoke to a mob, a crowd, and preached, trying to calm things down. So he was an athlete who stepped up and took a leadership role during the height of the events. I think Kavanaugh and Conyers acted as well as they could. The governor at the time, they called in the National Guard, so they certainly reacted to the situation, but both at the time and afterwards, putting together fact-finding commissions to try to see what. It was after that they began to do more to integrate the police department, to bring blacks into the police department.
Among those changes came an urban renewal project to help infrastructure and development. 58 years later, we're here in the heart of Detroit. These tall buildings around me prove that President Lyndon B. Johnson and Mayor Kavanaugh's urban renewal projects proved to be successful.
Congressman John Conyers aimed to decrease tensions and reassure his community. Being African American himself, Conyers wanted to improve Detroit's situation by addressing the elephant in the room. By personally going to the riots to try and reason with the protesters, John's main focus was to de-escalate the situation. Conyers actually held law enforcement accountable, proving to be a trusted figure at the time of the riots. His acknowledgement of the main cause of the problems was reassuring to the people of Detroit as he advocated for civil rights. Mayor Jerome Kavanagh made the first step to declare a state of emergency within the city and called for help from the National Guard and the President.
Request of local officials and law enforcement agencies, this action has been taken to provide such support as the state can extend in meeting this situation.
By working with John Conyers, they were able to restore order. Additionally, Kavanagh was determined to explain to the community what the city of Detroit had planned to do to manage. He created the Detroit Commission on Community Relations, which addressed racial tensions. In addition, Kavanagh pushed for housing projects in overpopulated and poorly kept African American neighborhoods.
The U.S. government addressed protesters, sent out public appeals, and acknowledged the systemic injustice that was happening over time. Other than the urban renewal programs he began, Mayor Kavanagh added more homeowner opportunities to increase homeownership amongst low-income families, supported policies to combat racial discrimination, and shaped many laws that would address the needs of Detroit's minority communities. Many efforts were undermined by structural racism and resistance from conservative government officials. The National Guard enforced curfews and tried to suppress looting and arson. Police used excessive force, including fatal shootings, increasing the sense of fear and chaos for all Detroiters. The riots and the government's response resulted in 43 people killed, over 1,000 injured, and over 5,000 people arrested. Certain projects were implemented into Detroit, like Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. It improved housing, education, healthcare, and infrastructure in impoverished neighborhoods. Many programs for employment were expanded across Detroit to allow for job training and education. While the riots were the most significant way of pushing for changes, organized protests and rallies were also effective ways of showing initiative. The election of black politicians allowed for African Americans to have a voice in their interests across Congress. This led to the election of Coleman Young as the first black mayor of Detroit, and resulted in stronger enforcement of the Fair Housing Act of 1968.
The riots emphasized the need for African Americans to fight for fair and equal rights. That resulted in a chain reaction that led to the discovery of black culture and identity. Celebrations across black history, art, and culture allowed for materialization of other identities. The riots caused economic decline in Detroit due to the destruction of properties and businesses, along with insurance companies refusing to cover riot-damaged property. Businesses and factories relocated to the suburbs, along with automation and globalization to further reduce job opportunities. When Dr. Norris was asked, "What do you think is the most significant outcome of the riots?" he said,
The significant change that I think happened immediately after the riots was white flight. Detroit was probably still a majority white city in 1967. And it quickly it became a majority black city after the riot. White families left the city in droves after the riots.
While the 1967 riots ended, civil unrest hasn't. Police brutality and racism are still prominent issues Americans face today. The most notable example of this is the 2020 Black Lives Matter protest, which was ignited due to the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, amongst many other instances of police brutality.